So we made a start at the end last week looking at German Expressionism, and the first thing we made a start at doing, was looking at the Die Brucke group, the bridge group, one of the important groups within German Expressionism. And in fact, we only made a start looking at the first artist of that group that I'll present, Kirchner. So, for instance, we looked at this work, The Three Nudes in a Forest of 1908. So a certain kind of attempt to get back in touch with spontaneity, get back in touch with emotions, intuitions, with nature, with life. It's a critique of modernity. Modernity has left us as kind of automatons and over-sophisticated, emotionally shallow, alienated people. So here is an alternative being offered, both at the level of subject matter and at the level of style, a very raw kind of style, and the subject matter is also kind of just naked human figures in nature, union with nature, harmony really. That's the big thing that's been broken with modernity, is our belonging to the wider universe. I'm just making it up myself in a way. What I'm saying is the idea behind these works, but I think this is the fundamental idea. So some interest in Kirchner's part of looking back to German artistic traditions to try and find alternative sources, but at the same time, and this is true for the other Brucke groups, very much looking towards Paris and the modern art that has taken place, developments in modern art that has taken place there. And that actually made them somewhat unpopular with the German art establishment, because like any other young country, in Germany as a unified country only came into existence in the early 1870s. There's a certain sort of trait of nationalism in German art, and all this interest in Paris-based tendencies kind of works against that, produces a kind of property that of internationalism in a way. So we'll see this perhaps again. There's sort of there's an international quality, but there's also a sort of Germanic quality, a conscious looking for German sources to find some alternative tradition, and looking at primitive art as well, so-called primitive art, the art of tribal peoples, as people who were considered to be more in touch with nature. It's almost an idea as if those tribal peoples are sort of relics or fossils of an earlier stage of human civilization, that they are us in our earlier stages. So looking at them, we're looking at our own past. That's a kind of idea that was a sort of linear notion of human development, which has been superseded now by more pluralistic understandings of culture, but common at that time. One thing that makes Kirchner stand out, and again I said this at the very end last week, from the other members of the bridge group, Die Brucke, is that not only did he present this alternative to modern urban civilization, he also made images of the city itself, but because of the attitude he has towards modernity, it's a critical view of modern life. So in this street in Dresden of 1907, the faces are reduced to these kind of opaque, mask-like representations, and of course Munch is one of the influences behind it, the independent Norwegian expressionist artist who's similar, almost sort of skull-like faces, I think are recalled here. Maybe it's also a reference to makeup, heavy, since the figures are female, they're dressed up in their city finery, but maybe they also have heavy makeup that was popular at the time. Nowadays, well, just looking around here, I don't see much contemporary interest in heavy makeup, but in certain cultural contexts that was very, very common. It could lead to the sense of the face as a kind of an invented thing. Here's another street scene by Kirchner from a few years later, 1913, 5 women in the street. So I want to compare this with the street in Dresden, since it's a very similar subject, to see the development of his art. And it's partly a development slightly later in time, so new artistic influences are coming to bear, but it's also a geographical factor. They've moved from the city of Dresden, which for a long time was in eastern Germany when Germany was divided, but a great sort of cultural capital, to the city of Berlin. It's an interesting question how where you are based will affect your art making, even within the same country, the same cultural environment. But different cities have different personalities, and that will affect you. I think one thing was that when they moved to Berlin, they were living less collectively. They had it's less of a group art that they're making at that point. There's less in common between the artists, so they start to go more their own ways. Clearly they're responding to a major metropolitan environment, though. There'll be some differences. I think it's clear he's now become aware of new developments in Western European art, primarily Cubism. Sometimes they get the influence of Cubism coming via Futurism. From our point of view, we think, Futurism happened, the sort of Cubist influence Futurism happened after Cubism itself, but from the point of view of an artist in Germany or in Russia, maybe the two things sort of arrive side by side, and they get slightly confused between them. So what I'm thinking of, for instance, is that the way the face here seems to be, it could be a profile view, but it almost seems like a cut view of the front of a face. There is this sort of more angular vocabulary of forms and slight sort of feeling of faceting that it reminds us of the vocabulary of Cubism before collage came along. All these sort of angular forms that he's created here, sharp forms in the figures themselves, finding all the accents in the feathers in her elaborate headdress, for instance, spiky forms. The feathers, well, a lot of them are wearing feathers, create these sort of dynamic shapes, link across the surface. But very flattened space, even more so than before. The background plane seems sort of raised up. It's very two-dimensional design, a sort of knitting in of the background and foreground forms. Whoops. Colour maybe has become a little less intense, hasn't it? And again, that could be something from Cubism, because Cubism in the hands of Picasso and Braque tended more towards a kind of monochrome, because they were exploring form more than colour. This larger sort of empty space here disappears. Already here the figures are quite sort of confrontational of the viewer, meeting our gaze directly, blocking our way through the space of the painting. I guess we read this as a tram or something like that. This is the tram lines. Maybe that's why they're leaving that space there. But here everything is much more blocked up. It's a wall of women sort of blocking our way through, and it's almost slightly kind of threatening feel. The road is nearby. We see the wheel of a vehicle. Yeah, so I think Cubism is the big difference in the style. It's not a. I wouldn't want to call it a Cubist painting. It doesn't show the full form Cubist style of fragmentation of figures, but they're just sort of stylistic mannerisms from Cubism. And a lot of artists in other countries did approach Cubism in that way. Like we saw Chagall, for instance. You take bits and pieces from Cubism, the Russian artist Chagall, who spent time in Paris. It's possible that we're meant to understand these as prostitutes, sort of a sort of archetypal denizen of the street, the woman of the street. There are some related studies which show the women talking to the figure in the car, things like that. So that gives us some indication that might be what what the subject matter is. Elongation, extending the forms. Again, it could be thinking back to the portal sculptures of the Romanesque and Gothic times, of cathedral portals, cathedral door sculptures. The Germanic kind of influence. The forms are more interlocking here, I would say, than the other one. Berlin's another city with a lot of museums for them to explore, and the museums include primitive art. I mean, Dresden's a great city for museums as well, but Berlin has its own particular interest. Well, just a few more images to look at quickly to show how much the themes I've already mentioned come back again. The dominant theme of nudity equals purity, nudity in nature, and related to their own summer trips to the countryside that they made as a group. So this is Bathers in Moritzburg, 1909, but then reworked a bit in 1926. The whole theme of the bathers is a kind of course, it appears in art history, in nudes in nature appears in art history, even in the Renaissance with mythological excuses. In the painting of Titian or something, Diana and her followers bathing and all that sort of thing. And we can think of modern paintings of bathers like Cézanne. So it has a kind of heritage that it's part of. Franzi with bow and arrow, 1910 to 11. So Franzi and Marcella are two young girls, I think sort of street children really, that they had sort of befriended a bit. And they get painted in studio scenes, used as models, with a bow and arrow. Is sort of this idea of the sort of the primitive, going back to the beginnings of things, of human civilization, throwing off sophistication. Marcella, this is the other of the two girls. So very simple, almost sort of crude in its simplicity, but deliberately so, deliberately unsophisticated. And in the background to this, I think, is Munch, very famous painting by Munch, Puberty. Munch is a very important presence for all of them. And it's similar to the Marcella painting in that being a picture of a girl, going through the transition to sexual maturity. Staring out directly towards the viewer. Even this shadow, which becomes a kind of looming presence in the background of the Munch painting, has its counterpart here in this work, Franzian carved chair, 1910. The carved chair she's sitting in would have been made by the artist. He's engaged in sculpture too, although I haven't really shown you that. The sculptures have a kind of quality of sort of primitivism to them, and some kind of echoes of African carving that he would look at, or oceanic carving that he looked at. Often those carvings are on objects of practical use. But the chair becomes this sort of looming presence, like the shadow in the Munch painting. So I think Munch is still at play here as an influence. Self-portrait with model, 1907. I'm jumping around a bit. Well, very strong complementary colour contrast, the blue and the orange. Almost purple. Very gendered, the artist is male, the model is female. The gender politics is not very advanced, you could say. Wrestlers in the Circus, around 1909. This is him coming back to the city again, and this time, instead of just a simple binary of countryside good, nature good, city and civilization bad, he's trying to find something within the city which he can treat as a positive thing, and he's finding the circus people as being a kind of something within the whole range of urban life that is more in touch with intuition of feeling and the body or whatever. So the wrestlers in the circus are maybe trying to represent something like that. There's that sort of romanticization of circus life, which you find the interest in it in Picasso's work as well. It's an early Rose period work. These the circus people travel around from place to place, so within the world of the city they're outsiders anyway. They're sort of marginal figures. They have that sort of special liminal status, outsider status. They're a bit like the artists, in the same way when Picasso paints circus folk, there's almost a sort of identification with them. Paints himself and his friends as if they are circus people. And just to show you from 1917, the Swiss peasant, one example of his woodcuts. Woodcuts are quite an important medium for Die Brucke. He goes to live in Switzerland in the later part of his life. Schmidt-Rottluff, I don't have much to say about him. I just give you one example of his work. Sometimes when I have presented Die Brucke, I've sort of left him out because I don't have time to talk about everyone. So I'm being selective through the whole course in picking certain artists to focus on. But he really is one of the stronger ones, so maybe I should just give you at least one example. This is his Houses at Night, 1912. When they all went off for their summer group expeditions, he didn't go with them. He went off on his own, so he had something slightly different. But he's one of the core members, one of the architecture students that founded the group. Same kind of broadly similar style, bright colour, but often this slightly acid quality rather than the more atmospheric, warm quality of much of the fauve art that they were inspired by. Jagged forms, creates a sense of rawness, emotive, flooding emotion into an image of the city at night. Night, of course, is a time when the normal purposes of things are not really being followed. So it's already a kind of a way of looking askew at city life to take it at night like this. Haeckel, also one of the founders of the group. Self-Portrait as a Young Man, 1906. It's a little bit like the Kirchner painting I showed you last week, Woman in the Birchwood, of the same year. This slightly more fragmented brushwork, which we could say it looks back to Van Gogh, that very the great impasto, but also maybe a little bit to Seurat and that kind of neo-impressionist creation of sensation of light by giving you broken touches that blur in the eye to greater luminosity. This is the style they had when they started. It wasn't quite so advanced as their manifesto might lead you to believe. In many ways, their most advanced work came through, in the early stage, came through their woodcuts. This is a later one, though, from 1919. It was a little bit easier to make radical simplifications of form in the medium of woodcut, because the medium almost requires you to do it. You have to think in terms of broad patches. In oil paint you don't, and somehow because you could make a realistic oil painting, when you don't make one, people may be a bit cross with you for you're not doing it properly. But with woodcuts, somehow their experiments were more accepted, or maybe they found it easier to be bold in woodcut first, and then that influenced their oil painting. Anyway, for whatever reason, this was a part of their output that was more widely accepted at the beginning, and remain very important part of their work, this graphic experimentation. They were interested in the woodcuts of Munch. That's another area of his influence on them. They tried to get him to contribute to their woodcut show when they had an exhibition. His woodcuts actually were probably better known in Germany than his paintings. Gauguin is another important artist, maybe, that they would have looked at his woodcuts. So sometimes the minor mediums can become important at certain moments of an artist's development. Not just woodcut, another print medium that interests him is etching. Street by the Harbour, 1910, so this is actually a little bit earlier. Etching is broadly the description of the medium, but to be a bit more precise, this is a dry point. Etching, you're scraping your design. Maybe step back and explain the whole process properly, because I'm not sure if everyone's familiar. Some of you may be very familiar. But etching, you work on a plate, then you cover the plate with some kind of varnish, and then you scrape with a stylus your linear design, whatever image you want, onto it. It's not like engraving where you're getting rid of the metal through effort. You're just scraping through the varnish, so you can make quite light kind of lines. It doesn't have to be a hard, heavy scraping kind of line. And then you dip the whole thing in a bath of acid, and the acid eats away at the metal where it's been exposed through the varnish by your work. And then you wash it off when it's been bitten by the acid enough. You wash it off, and then you take a solvent to dissolve the varnish that's been protecting the surface. So you have a metal plate with lines cut into it, and it's cut into it by acid, so it doesn't have the sense of a human touch. It's a very sharp kind of line. Then you put the ink on the plate, but you put the ink in the lines, unlike the woodcut where you're putting the ink on the surfaces that haven't been cut away, the upper surface. So it's a reverse. You could leave some ink on the surface if you wanted that effect, but most of the time you're not going to do so. You're going to wipe the surface clean of any excess ink. Then you print at high pressure because with the paper slightly damp, so it's forced into the lines to pick up the ink. So the lines in an etching have a physical projection from the surface. That's the difference between printing with a woodblock print, where you're printing from under low pressure, taking from the exposed surfaces. But dry point is it's a kind of refinement of etching technique where you don't use the varnish and you don't use the acid bath. You just scrape freehand, and the metal instead of being eaten away, it's still there, it's just pushed aside. You get a kind of metal burr, so that when you print it, ink it and print it, there's going to be some trace of that burr, and that's why you get this slight feathery quality. So it has its different expressive possibilities than etching, pure etching. There's a detail to show you something of that. You still, because you're printing under pressure, so it still produces this sharp kind of line that very different from the line you'd get in a drawing. So that's the part of what you're doing when you're doing etching. You're trying to get that particular qualities of line. Of course, the other advantage is that you can make multiple copies, and you can have different stages. You could print it, and then you could, make some more marks. Many great artists, Rembrandt or Picasso or whatever, have produced different stages of their etching. In our digital world, we're used to the idea that you can keep a copy and then you can rework it as well. We can have our cakes and eat them, but in more traditional mediums, that's not always the case. So etching produces that sort of flexibility. Although with the dry point, you can't make too many copies because of the high pressure, it's going to damp down the burr, which gives this lovely kind of feathery look. I don't really know what's going on here. It may be that he's just left some ink on the surface of the plate too, because really with etching, then you don't normally get that kind of area effect. You can produce it through aquatint, but I don't know. It doesn't really look quite like aquatint to me. So maybe dry point is appropriate for this sort of expressionistic rawness. It's a more sort of. Sometimes people think of printing techniques, etching and so forth, as being very time-consuming, long, technical processes, but actually dry point is fairly immediate. And to show you his painting too, Haeckel, his Glassy Day, 1913. Well, we see how he's interested in the same iconography as Kirchner, nude in nature, symbolic of a reattained harmony or oneness with the natural environment. Here also, like in the later Kirchner work, you're seeing something of an influence of Cubism, but it's a very delicate, mild influence of Cubism. The figure still has quite strong outlines. There isn't that sort of fragmentation of the figure and linking to the environment in that sense at a formal level, which you get with Cubism. Even though the theme of the work is a sort of linking between the figure and nature. The link is done maybe by sort of echoing, or the angular forms of the figure echoes the vocabulary of the landscape. The colour blends her in with the environment behind her. She's very anonymous, almost no facial features. The massive mountain scenery reflected in the still surface of the water. One imagines a pond or lake, and the angular forms of those reflections, or of the mountains themselves, which all comes from a Cubist vocabulary. And the fragmentation of Cubism is mimicked a bit through reflections in the water surface, but that's a sort of safe way of doing it. You're not having to take on board the whole language of Cubism. There are certain artists who do that. They'll show reflections in a window or something like that, and that creates a sort of Cubist-like fragmentation. Nolde. So this is not a very good slide. Carve, Stave, 1904. So it's a work by him from before the time he got together with the Brucke group. He's slightly older than the others, and his whole background is rather different. A sort of more like you could say a kind of peasant background, whereas they were sort of architecture students, different kind of social background. And he's only associated really with them for a short while, maybe 18 months or so. He's really connected with them. He learned the woodcut techniques from them. That's something he got from his association. But he already had, because of his rural or peasant background, he already had this sort of feeling for nature in his earlier works, which this one is an example of. Everything seems, nature seems alive. I mean, there's sort of, it's a harvest, as the title says, and they're sort of raking the hay or whatever it is. But it's almost like a surface of an ocean, and everything is very alive and mobile. The earth is as mobile as the sky. Of course, the very free brushwork helps to create that. So he talks in an almost pantheistic way, as a sense of being at one with nature. He says, "Wherever I looked, nature was alive, the sky, the clouds, on every stone, and amongst the branches of the trees. Everywhere my creatures stirred and lived their still or wild, lively lives, arousing my excitement and crying out to be painted." There's also this very nationalistic side to his thinking. It's there with all of them. And, nationalism is one of the big ideas of the 19th century. It's the century where nation states come into being in Italy and Germany, by 1911, 1912 in China also. And, so much of the causes of the First World War was nationalism, say Serbian nationalism, trying to break down the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the ages of empires was coming to an end, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Qing Empire, you know, in the face of Han nationalism, Sun Yat-sen, all that sort of thing. So, yeah, it's a big idea of the 19th century and spills into the 20th century, sometimes with rather virulent versions. Of course, in Germany more than almost anywhere else, and perhaps just literally more than anywhere else, with the rise of the Nazis and the horrific things that they got up to, vast, systematic, organized slaughter of the Jewish citizens, for instance, the Holocaust. To create a sense of national feeling, you've always got to have other people that you're against. You know, there's always got to be this sort of negative side to it. It's often leading to warfare. So there's that sort of negative edge. All this idea of trying to recover your vitality that we're seeing in expressionistic art, you know, trying to get back in touch with your intuitions. It could be tied up with the sort of idea that, oh, you know, our race is being defiled by the blood of other people, or those Jewish people or whatever, you know, they're intermingling and marrying our daughters, and we shouldn't let this sort of thing happen. All this kind of racist thinking starts to come into national thinking. And Nolde actually got caught up with all this. He says, this German nationalist thinking. He says, in Germany now, we must create a great German art, a second period. The first was in the days of Grunewald, Holbein, and Dürer. The great struggle forward. I feel part of this struggle and hope that the second great period of German art will come. So this is in a sense, a kind of innocuous idea, but it gets carried forward into Nazi nationalistic thinking. In the end, the Nazis turned against expressionism. It becomes too associated with the earlier pre-Nazi period, the Weimar Republic period, and they actually hold it up as a negative thing, as a sign of degeneration, of national degeneration. But there was a time when some of the Nazi leaders themselves even were interested in German Expressionism. Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, he owned works by Nolde and Schmidt-Rottluff and others, and supported them for a while. So, yeah, he's caught up in that. He actually joined the Nazi party, but in 1920, which is very early on, it's before the Nazis did most of the horrific things that they were later to do after they came to power in 1933. So you can't quite hold him responsible for what happened later, but you can see how art can be ambivalent. It can join into negative things. I suppose the deep point I'm trying to make is that modern art isn't all good. We saw that in a way with Italian Futurism, how some of those artists kind of get involved with Italian fascism, with Mussolini. How did the Nazis get to power? It's because they did draw on some real feelings which were there, that people had. Although we think of them as one of the most horrific regimes in human history, they must have had an appeal to gain their power. You know, in a certain sense, it was a utopian project. You know, they presented it to people as something positive. Back to Nolde. So yeah, he learnt woodblock print, wood carving from his friends in the Die Brucke group, but yeah, he did some lovely things with it, and this is one of his most well-known woodcuts, The Prophet, 1912. And again, of course, the medium requires this extreme simplification, which works well. One aspect of the appeal of woodcut as a medium is that there are quite a few good examples from earlier periods of German art. It's a medium that has a certain kind of medieval or Germanic historical association to it. You think of the great woodcuts of Dürer. Fantastic contribution to the whole history of that medium coming from a German artist. So even medium can have national association. We see that a lot here at the moment, the last few years, in auctions and so forth. You get a lot of promotion of ink art. Ink becomes a kind of national medium at the level of actual materials. There's a sort of sense of some materials being more Chinese than others. Of course, it's a kind of distortion in a way of Chinese art history. A Chinese artist who uses oil paint is no less Chinese than one who uses ink. And when artists in China used ink in the past, they weren't doing so to be Chinese. They didn't think about things like that. It was just literati culture or something like that. That's their identity. So it's a sort of reading back onto the art of the past, a certain kind of modern nationalist notion. Nationalism infects everything. It infects art, but it can also infect art history. So you end up finding that art history is written from a nationalistic perspective too. And that's very understandable, particularly in those countries who haven't had a big place within the broader narrative of art history. But nevertheless, you still have to be a bit watchful about it, that it hasn't sort of misconstrued historical realities. So show you some of his later paintings, the CB 1930. Well, just because I think it's a rather nice one. In a broad sense, it all fits into a tradition of romanticism. Projecting of human emotion onto the landscape. The Romantics in the 19th century, in Germany as much as anywhere else, revitalized landscape painting by giving it a new task. In the first great era of landscape painting, the 17th century, in Holland especially, landscape was never there to carry kind of spiritual ideas, but in the Romantic era, Turner or Friedrich certainly do give it that kind of task. And an artist like Nolde, in broad terms, is within that framework. He made a journey just before the First World War to German colonies in the Pacific Ocean. This is one of the works that dates from that time, Tropical Sun, 1914. So the First World War began in 1914. He was there on this visit in 1913, invited to join an expedition to the German colonies in the Pacific. And he returns just after the war starts in 1914, so this is Tropical Sun of 1914. So he's really quite interested in so-called primitive art. It tends to be, as I said last time, the artists of countries that had colonies in Africa and Oceania that were the ones that become most interested in it, partly because they could see the objects that were taken from those cultures in their home countries' museums. He wrote a piece for about primitive art for a book that came out in 1912. Wrote the introduction for the book on so-called primitive art. it's an outdated notion, the notion of primitive. Nowadays we want to think of cultures as just different rather than just put them in a linear developmental model. But there they did. So often he's seeing these objects in museums. Particularly, he takes up an interest in masks. So masks seen in ethnographical museums. And art historians have identified particular works in Berlin collections that he represents in these mask paintings, of which there are several. So it maybe gives him an excuse for distorting forms. Primitive art doesn't accept realism anyway, so it gives you an excuse to. I think he starts off by a sort of emotional kind of sympathy with these are people who are more in touch with nature, and then it's only at a slightly later stage he's saying, well, let me look at the specifics of their art and see if there's something I can learn from that. He talks about, he says, the absolute originality, the intense, often grotesque expression of force and life in the very simplest form. That may well be what gives us pleasure in these aboriginal works. What we're looking at here is the Still Life Masks 1 from 1911. So this is from before his trip. As well as masks, which are a kind of common thing to find in ethnographic museums, another source for his interest in masks is the Belgian artist Ensel. Ensel's famous for making these paintings of mask figures. In his case, the mask motif comes from the carnival, from the masquerade. So it's a sort of more European source, and that's all feeds into Nolde's concern. Nolde was very interested in, and so he actually visited him at a certain time. Ensel's a slightly isolated artist working in the coastal area of Belgium. His family owned a shop where they sold these sort of carnival masks, curios and things like that. So there's all these sort of personal associations for him. But he's also turning it into a way of showing modern life as sort of full of artificiality and falseness. We all wear our social personas, our social masks. We play certain roles. We're not authentic anymore. So this is Ensel Intrigue, 1911. Nolde became ill around 1909, and after his recovery, he starts to come out with certain religious works. He had a certain new sort of religious impulse after that time. But it's not like he didn't join up with some organized religion. He's not interested in that sort of thing. It's more a kind of personal, emotional, primitive approach to religion. And this is really the beginning of that. There are several, but this is really the beginning. This is one of the very earliest. I think the Last Supper is the first. This is the Last Supper, and this is the Pentecost. So two, similar works that represent moments of the life of Christ. Very thickly painted. They seem to sort of glow from within, like a sort of inner artificial light. This is the moment of the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit entering the disciples, so it's very that more kind of emotive approach to religion that's emphasized. Or even when he represents the Last Supper, the same thing, a very kind of emotive event, communal emotion. It's not about doctrine or something like that. It's more intuitive, emotive, very schematic. The faces here very mask-like, so there's some sort of interplay between the actual paintings of masks and the mask-like treatment of faces in other works. Expressive, bright colour, light as if from within. Space very, shallow and undelineated. One critic told him, if you want to sell your works, you must make them milder. And his reply was, it's exactly the opposite that I'm striving for, strength and inwardness. He planned this sort of 9-part Life of Christ, painting from through 1911, 1912. But this Pentecost painting was rejected by the Secession exhibition, and some kind of troubles with the mainstream church about it all. Tended to work more from imagination, but he talks about not wanting to have too definite an idea before you start painting. Actually, I can quote what he says. He says, none of the free imaginative pictures that I painted at this time or later had any kind of model or even a clearly conceived idea. It was quite easy for me to imagine a work down to its smallest details, and in fact my preconceptions were usually far more beautiful than the painted outcome. I became the copyist of the idea. Therefore I liked to avoid thinking about a picture beforehand. All I needed was a vague idea in terms of luminescence or colour. The work then developed of its own accord under my hands. Later on in his life, he produces quite a few watercolours that are interesting. I mean, he's done them before, but this is a particular strength of later work. These flower watercolours, iris and poppy, and red poppy. Sometimes you almost feel as if he's been looking at Chinese art, and sort of the fluidity, the sense of wash. And of course in the 20th century there is this dialogue from the Chinese side with Western watercolour. That is a minor medium in the West, but it's something that is particularly open for dialogue with by Chinese artists who are using water-based medium as their main medium. And during the Nazi years, although he had been an early member of the Nazi party, as an expressionist artist, he's refused to, he's not really allowed to paint. So he goes to secretly use watercolour because it doesn't leave the smell that oil paint does, that gives away what you've been doing. So these are smaller images. That's one of the problems we have. Everything is blown up to the same scale. So I'm giving, everything has a certain kind of homogeneity in our presentation of it. Okay, let's have our break there. I've kept you a bit late, but I wanted to finish looking at Die Brucke, and then after the break we'll look at the Blue Rider group, the Blau Reiter.